From childhood, we learn a simple truth. A dog is man's best friend, a loyal companion, a protector, a helper. But then why, when we want to truly insult someone, to humiliate them, do we turn to this seemingly noble image? Think about how much negativity and contempt are packed into expressions like "a dog's life," "you dirty dog," or the infamous "son of a bitch." This strange pattern can be found in many cultures. For example, in Polish, one of the strongest curses is psia krew, which literally translates to dog's blood. Why did the blood of a dog, and not a wolf or a bear, become a synonym for something vile and low? If our ancestors wanted to emphasize someone's animalistic cruelty or wildness, they could have used images of far more dangerous predators. But no, this illogical, almost irrational aversion became ingrained in the collective consciousness. It's as if behind the image of the domestic dog hides another, more ancient and frightening prototype. As if our collective memory, our cultural code, holds a vague but very disturbing recollection. What if all these insults are not just words, but an echo of a long-gone era? An echo of a ruthless war for survival, the remnants of which still sound in our speech today. What if, once upon a time, living alongside man was not a faithful friend, but a sworn enemy? A creature that was frighteningly similar to us, but was not one of us. Imagine an intelligent adversary, anthropomorphic, with a body like a human, but the head of a dog. This is no longer just an animal, it's a competitor, another intelligent species fighting for the same resources, for the same land. This struggle must have been so brutal and long that the memory of it was burned into our subconscious, and when the enemy itself disappeared from the pages of history, only the hatred remained, frozen in language. The insults we use today might be the last monument to this forgotten foe. And perhaps this hypothesis is not as fantastic as it seems at first glance. After all, what if this enemy didn't just vanish into the mists of time? What if it continued to exist side by side with us for much longer than we can imagine? And this journey from vague guesses to shocking facts begins not in ancient myths, but in the forests of Siberia, in the records of a doctor who, in the 19th century, encountered the unimaginable.
This sinister shadow in our language, this inexplicable legacy of enmity, it all could have remained just a curious linguistic theory if it weren't for the astonishing evidence that lies much closer to our own time. Our path from the depths of the subconscious to tangible facts leads us to the not-so-distant 19th century, to the very heart of the vast and mysterious Siberian taiga. This is a story documented not by a mystic or a dreamer, but by a man of science, a doctor named Nikolai Kozhukov. In 1838, while wandering through the dense forests near Tomsk, he found himself in a situation that would forever change his perception of the world. Picture the scene: a remote hunting cabin, lost for hundreds of kilometers from civilization, the piercing morning cold, and a silence broken only by the snapping of twigs. It was in this setting that the stunned Dr. Kozhukov met his guests. On the threshold of his modest dwelling stood creatures that at first seemed to him like small bears. They were short men, their bodies covered in thick hair. Their necks were so short that their heads seemed to almost merge with their shoulders. But the most striking feature was their faces. Round eyes stared at the doctor with wary curiosity, and their features were inhuman. The guests came in peace. As a gift, they brought a hide filled to the brim with thick, fragrant wild honey. The astonished doctor, in turn, shared with them the most valuable things he had in the wilderness: salt and matches. And this is where the most incredible thing happened. These creatures, with their strange, beast-like appearance, began to speak. Their speech was decent, quite understandable, though it was full of old, archaic words, as if they were speaking the language of their great-grandfathers. Dr. Kozhukov learned that these people called themselves the Little Ones, and had lived in these forests since immemorial. They deliberately avoided contact with outsiders, and only made contact in extreme cases to trade furs for essential items, clothes, dishes, or salt. And Dr. Kozhukov, whose scientific mind was struggling to find any explanation for this, was burning with curiosity. He asked if he could visit their settlement, but the beastmen replied that they had no permanent settlement as such. They led a nomadic lifestyle, following the game, hunting, and fishing. For shelter, they used ancient mud huts built by their ancestors, which they merely maintained. And with that, their conversation ended. The guests left as quietly as they had appeared, leaving Dr. Kozhukov alone with thoughts that turned his entire scientific worldview upside down. This story could have been dismissed as fatigue, a hallucination, or a forest mirage, if not for its continuation. Upon returning to Tomsk, Kojushkov told his cousin, Colonel Mitrokin, about his incredible adventure, and the colonel's reaction was no less shocking than the encounter itself. He wasn't surprised at all. Moreover, he confirmed that all the locals, especially those involved in the fur trade, knew perfectly well about the little ones. These forest dwellers were part of a hidden but very real taiga economy. They regularly exchanged their rich hunting spoils for goods from the big world. To the local traders, they were just another wild tribe, albeit an extremely unusual one. Thus, Dr. Kojushkov's story ceased to be just a tall tale. It became a documented testimony, confirmed by another person. In the wilds of Siberia, just a couple of centuries ago, lived a tribe of beings that combined human and animal traits, possessed speech, and led their own hidden way of life. And this fact, this Siberian encounter, is like a key that opens the door to a much deeper past. For if they were seen in the 19th century, what about the centuries before? It turns out that the most respected historians and philosophers of antiquity knew much more about them, and wrote about them as a very real people inhabiting different corners of our planet. Dr. Kojushkov's story in the Siberian wilderness ceases to be a mere anomaly and becomes a key, unlocking a stunning panorama of the past. It turns out that this remarkable account is only the latest, most recent page in a multi-volume chronicle kept by the greatest minds of humanity for millennia. The encounter in the Siberian taiga is not the beginning of the story, but its echo. To understand the scale of this phenomenon, we need to travel through centuries and continents, listening to the whispers of those whose names have become synonymous with wisdom and knowledge. And we begin with the founding father of history itself, Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian, whose works form the basis of all Western civilization, was a meticulous and inquisitive researcher. Traveling through Africa and describing the lands of modern-day Tunisia, he scrupulously listed the local fauna. In his list, among very real giant snakes, lions, elephants, and venomous vipers, he mentions dog-headed men as if it were a matter of course. For Herodotus, they were as much a part of the African world as any other exotic animal. He wasn't inventing them. He was merely stating a fact that was apparently common knowledge.
Let's move eastward to the heart of the mighty Persian Empire. Here, at the court of King Artaxerxes II, served another Greek as a personal physician, Ctesias of Cnidus. As a doctor, he possessed a keen, observant mind and had access to a wide variety of information flowing in from all corners of the vast empire. In his records, he describes in detail one of the peoples inhabiting the highlands of India. According to Ctesias, these people were dark-skinned and sinewy, dressed in the hides of wild animals, and did not possess human speech, communicating with each other and with outsiders through gestures. He estimated their population at an astonishing figure, about 120,000, and their main distinguishing feature was a head that differed little from that of a dog. The Romans, with their passion for systematizing and cataloging everything, picked up the baton. Pliny the Elder, creator of natural history, essentially the world's first encyclopedia, devotes a separate mention to the Cynocephaly. He also places them in the mountains of India and describes them in almost the same words as Ctesias. They dress in animal skins, bark instead of speaking, are armed with claws, and live by hunting beasts and birds. His information is repeated almost word for word by Megasthenes, who was on a diplomatic mission to the court of the great unifier of India, Chandragupta. These are no longer just retellings of rumors, but testimonies obtained from different sources and at different times, all converging on the key details. But perhaps one of the most significant pieces of evidence was left to us by a man whose name has become a byword for any traveler, Marco Polo. Having spent many years in China and its neighboring territories, he didn't just repeat others' legends. In his notes, he stated directly that he had seen these creatures with his own eyes on the islands of the Andaman archipelago. For him, this was not a fairy tale, but a part of the real world he was exploring. And what is most astounding is that it wasn't only secular historians and travelers who spoke of these creatures. They became a subject of serious theological reflection for the most authoritative Christian authors. St. Augustine, one of the greatest church fathers, posed a most difficult philosophical question in his foundational work, The City of God. Reflecting on the diversity of peoples, he wrote, "What should be said of the Cynocephaly, whose dog-like head and barking proclaimed them beasts rather than men?" He did not doubt their existence. For him, it was a given that posed a theological problem. Are these beings descendants of Adam? Do they possess a soul? Following him, Isidore of Seville, author of the first Christian encyclopedia, placed the Cynocephaly in the section describing the real monstrous races of the world. Thus, we are faced not with a chain of coincidences, but with a global mosaic. From the Africa of Herodotus to the India of Ctesias, from Marco Polo's China to the works of the Church Fathers, everywhere we find mentions of the same people. They were so real to the people of the past that they were not just described in books. They were given a specific place in this world, their lands plotted on maps as completely real and existing territories. The testimonies of the greatest minds of antiquity in the Middle Ages are a powerful argument, but words, even the most authoritative, remain just words. It is another matter entirely to see the proof with your own eyes. And our ancestors left us just such proof. Silent parchment witnesses that transform vague descriptions into a clear geographical reality. We are talking about maps. For a medieval person, a world map, or mappa mundi, was not just a diagram of continents and oceans. It was a comprehensive tapestry of the known world, which included not only cities and rivers, but also biblical scenes, exotic animals, and all the peoples created by God, no matter how strange they seemed. And on these maps, the most detailed and respected of their time, the dog-headed people were given their rightful place. Take a look at the famous Ebstorf map, created in the 13th century. This grandiose document, a true portrait of the worldview of that era, is teeming with details. And among them, alongside other peoples, we find an image of a Cynocephalus. This is not just a sketch of a monster in the margins. This is a full-fledged inhabitant of this world, complete with a detailed legend. The inscription next to the figure reads, "The Cynocephali are so called because they have dogs' heads and faces. Their clothing is animal skins, and their voice is a dog's bark." Moreover, he's not depicted as a wild beast. In his hands, he holds a bow and arrow. He is a warrior, a hunter, a member of his society. This is not just a drawing. It's a passport certifying his existence and place in the world order. But if you think they were placed somewhere on mythical, unknown fringes, another great map of that time, the Hereford map, offers an even bigger surprise. Here, the cartographers placed the dog-headed people not in distant India or mysterious Africa, but much closer, in the cold lands of Scandinavia. For the map's creators, this was as real a part of geography as England or France. The dog-headed people were their northern neighbors. This radically changes the perception. From an exotic curiosity, they become a specific people inhabiting a very definite region of Europe. And this was not the fruit of a single cartographer's imagination. This information is confirmed in written sources, for example, in the treatise Cosmographia, attributed to Archbishop Virgilius of Salzburg. Describing a journey around Europe, the author, after passing Britain and Ireland, arrives at an island of the Cynocephaly, located somewhere on the north, and gives a surprisingly detailed description of their way of life. According to him, these pagans went bare-chested and grew their hair to incredible lengths, anointing it with fat. Their diet consisted of unclean animals, such as mice and cats. They did not build permanent structures, but lived in woven shelters and tents, preferring inaccessible swamps and forest thickets. At the same time, they had an unheard-of abundance of cattle and sheep. But the author saved the most stunning and inexplicable testimony for last. He claimed that the women of this people had a completely normal human appearance, and only the men were born with a dog's head. Stop and think about this detail. This is no longer just a description of a strange tribe. It is a biological paradox that shatters all conventional notions. How is such a thing even possible? This calls into question all simple explanations. But before we try to solve this riddle, an even shocking discovery awaits us. It turns out that these creatures didn't just live on the edges of the world. One of them, according to ancient texts, managed not only to enter human society, but to rise to an unimaginable height within it, entering the Holy of Holies, the pantheon of Christian great martyrs. We have seen them on maps as a savage people inhabiting distant lands. We have read about them in chronicles as a strange but real part of this world. But no ancient text, no old map can prepare us for the next discovery. For a paradox that shatters all notions of the boundaries between man and monster, holiness and savagery. It turns out that one of these creatures didn't just come into contact with the human world. It burst into it, traveled the path from beast to righteous man, and forever entered the Holy of Holies, the pantheon of Christian great martyrs.
This story concerns one of the most famous and revered figures in Christianity, Saint Christopher, the patron saint of travelers. Millions of people around the world wear his image, believing it will protect them on their journey. His depiction, a mighty giant carrying the small Christ child across a raging river, is familiar to everyone. But beneath the layer of later, more familiar images, lies his original, shocking appearance. Early hagiographies and icons, especially in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, depict him without any allegory, with the head of a dog.
According to these ancient texts, before his conversion, Christopher was a giant warrior of enormous height who struck terror throughout Palestine. He came from the tribe of the Cynocephaly, and his dog's head was not a deformity, but a fearsome weapon that helped him in battle. He was the embodiment of primal strength and followed a simple principle: to serve whoever was the most fearsome and powerful of all. First, he entered the service of a local king, but soon realized that the king feared the devil. So Christopher left him and decided that there was no one in the world more terrible than the Lord of Darkness, and he began to serve him. He became his faithful warrior, embodying evil and destruction. However, one day he saw his powerful master flee in fear from a simple roadside cross. And then the Cynocephalus realized that there was a power before which even evil itself trembled. This discovery turned his world upside down. He left his dark lord and went in search of the one who was stronger than all. His journey led him to a hermit who told him about Christ and taught him to serve people in his name. Thus, the giant with the dog's head began his repentance, carrying travelers across the dangerous river on his mighty shoulders. It was here that the famous encounter with the child took place, whose weight turned out to be heavier than the whole world, for it was Christ himself. After this event, he was baptized and received his name, Christopher, which means Christ-bearer. He became a zealous servant of God and went to Lycia in modern-day Turkey, where he converted many people to the new faith through his example and preaching. Of course, such activities could not go unnoticed by the authorities. During the persecution of Christians under the Emperor Trajan, Christopher was captured. He faced fierce opposition and endured cruel trials, but he did not renounce his faith. In the end, his earthly journey came to a close, and the church numbered him among the great martyrs for his steadfastness and faith. How is this possible? How could a creature that ancient authors described as a savage and Saint Augustine considered more beast than man enter the choir of saints? For the early church, there was no contradiction in this. On the contrary, the story of Christopher the Cynocephalus was a powerful symbol of all-encompassing divine grace. It proved that the light of faith could penetrate any shell, even the most bestial, and transform the wildest and most terrifying creature into the image and likeness of God. It was the ultimate story of redemption.
Over time, as the world became more enlightened and rational, this original image became inconvenient. It stood out too much from the conventional picture of the world. And gradually, on icons and frescoes, the dog's head was replaced by the face of a stern but entirely human giant. The original shocking meaning was lost, replaced by a simpler and more understandable allegory. But the ancient images remain as silent testimony to this incredible story. And the story of Saint Christopher the Cynocephalus poses an even deeper question to us. If one of them possessed reason, will, and the capacity for spiritual transformation, what were they really like? Let us gather all the scattered evidence and try to create a complete portrait of them. The story of Saint Christopher the Cynocephalus takes our investigation to a whole new level. We can no longer perceive these beings as mere wild animals or mythical monsters. If one of them was capable of complex spiritual evolution, it means they possessed reason, self-awareness, and a complex inner life. Now that we are convinced of their widespread presence in history, from the Siberian taiga to the Christian pantheon, it is time to piece together all the scattered descriptions and try to create their most complete and objective portrait. Let us set aside speculation and focus on the details that are repeated in the testimonies of different authors from different eras. The first thing that catches the eye is the striking diversity in height. On one hand, we have the story of Christopher, a giant warrior whose height is described as colossal, reaching 2 or even 2.5 meters. On the other, we have Dr. Kojukov's report about the little ones from near Tomsk, whom he describes as short men, barely half human height.
This suggests that the Cynocephaly were probably not a single homogeneous people, but rather a whole group of related species or subspecies, much like there are pygmies and the tall Tuti tribes in Africa. As for their physique, all sources agree. The body of a Cynocephalus was anthropomorphic: 2 arms, 2 legs, upright posture. Their arms and chest are described as quite hairy, but not completely covered in fur, which distinguishes them from apes. Their fingers were equipped with small claws, large enough to serve as weapons, but not so large as to interfere with using tools. Some authors, though few, note the presence of a tail, specifying that it was not fluffy like most dogs, but smooth-haired, similar to that of a Great Dane.
The main and defining feature, of course, was the head. All witnesses describe it as dog-like, but if you read into the details, a more complex picture emerges. The entire head was covered with short hair, the color of which varied from reddish to brown, occasionally gray. Sometimes a thick mane is mentioned on the back of the neck, giving it a resemblance to a hyena. And this is not a random comparison. It seems the head of a Cynocephalus was something between that of a dog, a jackal, and a hyena. The snout was elongated, even pointed like a jackal's, but the ears were round like a hyena's, and, most importantly, set on the sides of the head, not on top, that is, in the human manner. It was a bizarre but functional combination of features from different predators. Their language is described unequivocally as barking or growling. However, the fact that the Siberian little ones could communicate passably in Old Russian suggests that their vocal apparatus was also capable of articulate speech. Their native language was just structured completely differently. Regarding their eating habits, all authors are unanimous. The Cynocephaly were carnivores or omnivores, but with a clear preference for meat. They are described as aggressive and not squeamish about any prey, including intelligent beings, even their own kind. But they were not just a pack of wild animals. All sources point to the existence of a social structure. The tribe was organized on the principle of a wolf pack. At the head was the strongest male leader, surrounded by several lower-ranking fighters. The leader's power was absolute, especially during a hunt or in times of danger. It is noteworthy that women had their own parallel hierarchy. The leader of the female part of the tribe was not necessarily the leader's mate, but the strongest and most authoritative female. And it was she, as a rule, who became the leader's partner, not the other way around. Monogamy, it seems, was not practiced in their society. And finally, the most important detail that definitively separates them from the animal world. All historians, from Pliny to medieval cartographers, agree on one thing. The dog-headed people did not go naked. They wore clothes made from animal skins. This indicates the presence of technology, self-awareness, and a certain culture. This composite portrait paints a picture of a complex, intelligent, and dangerous species that lived alongside humans for centuries. They were savages, warriors, and even, as we have seen, saints. But legends have also preserved the memory of a time when one of them could wear not just the skin of a beast, but a royal crown. The portrait we have assembled paints a picture of an intelligent, complex, and dangerous species that lived on the periphery of the human world for centuries. We have seen them as savages, warriors, and even saints. But folk memory, breaking through the thickness of ages, has preserved even more amazing stories. What if the Cynocephaly were not always outcasts? What if, at some point, one of them managed to break through the barrier of fear and alienation and ascend to the very pinnacle of human society? What if a dog-headed man wore not only clothes of skins, but a royal crown? It seems unthinkable, but just such a story, full of tragedy and loneliness, has come down to us in the form of a Croatian legend, preserved and retold by a 104-year-old local woman, Jurka Petrikević. This story is not about a monster on the throne, but about a deep personal drama, about the burden of a secret heavier than any crown. The legend says that long ago in Croatia there ruled a king. He was wise and just, but no one had ever seen his full face. He lived in constant fear because under his royal headdress he hid a terrible secret. He had a human body, but the head of a dog. His greatest nightmare was that someone would find out, and to keep his secret he was forced to perform a monstrous ritual. Every day, a new young man was brought to him to shave him, and every day after, the young man was put to death so that he could not reveal what he had seen. The kingdom lived in fear, and the king, in icy solitude,
trapped by his own secret. But one day, the turn came for the only son of a widow. The mother, driven mad with grief, could not accept the loss of her child and decided on a desperate act. The night before her son was to go to the palace, she kneaded dough for bread. But into the flour and water, she added something priceless, a few drops of her own mother's milk. She baked the bread and told her son to offer it to the king before he began his dreadful task. The young man, trembling with fear, appeared before the ruler. But before picking up the razor, he held out the bread his mother had baked. The king, surprised by such boldness, broke off a piece. The bread seemed so sweet and delicious, unlike anything he had ever tasted. He ate it all with pleasure and asked the young man the secret of its amazing taste. And then the young man revealed the secret. "This bread is so sweet because my mother added her milk to it." Hearing this, the king froze. Having tasted a mother's milk, he had, by ancient law, become a sworn brother to this young man. He could no longer harm him. For the first time in many years, his cruel ritual was broken. He spared the young man's life, but made him swear a terrible oath, never to tell anyone the secret of the dog's head.
Юноша был счастлив, что остался в живых, и честно хранил клятву. Но тяжесть королевской тайны оказалась для него невыносимой ношей. Она давила на него днем и ночью. Он не мог ни есть, ни спать. Чувствуя, что он вот-вот сойдет с ума, он однажды убежал далеко в поле, выкопал в черной земле ямку, наклонился к ней и прошептал в самую ее глубь: «Черная земля, знай, у нашего короля песья голова». Ему сразу стало легче. Он закопал ямку и вернулся домой, уверенный, что его тайна теперь надежно похоронена. Но рядом с тем местом росла бузина. И случилось так, что вскоре мимо проходил пастух, который срезал одну из ее ветвей, чтобы смастерить себе новую дудочку. Когда он вырезал инструмент и поднес его к губам, чтобы сыграть мелодию, из дудочки полились не звуки музыки, а слова, ясные и четкие. «У нашего короля песья голова». Тайна, нашептанная земле, проросла сквозь корни бузины, впиталась в ее древесину и теперь звучала на всю округу. Весть облетела все королевство. От короля с собачьей головой все отвернулись. Он остался один, покинутый, одинокий и небритый, навсегда запертый в своем обличии, которое он так отчаянно пытался скрыть. Эта история показывает нам не монстра, а существо, способное страдать и желать быть принятым. И глядя на все эти свидетельства, от древних карт до трагических легенд, мы неизбежно подходим к главному, самому сложному вопросу. Если они действительно были здесь, если они жили среди нас, то что же с ними стало? Итак, мы прошли этот долгий и извилистый путь до самого конца. Мы начали наше путешествие с простого вопроса, с загадочного шепота, застывшего в наших собственных языках, с необъяснимой ненависти к образу собаки, заложенной в древних ругательствах. Этот шепот привел нас в заснеженную сибирскую тайгу XIX века, где врач-прагматик лицом к лицу столкнулся с живыми представителями этого забытого народа. Оттуда мы погрузились в глубину веков, вслушиваясь в голоса Геродота, Плиния и Марко Поло, которые говорили о собакоголовых людях не как о мифе, а как о реальной части мира. Мы видели их земли, нанесенные на самые авторитетные карты Средневековья, как неоспоримую географическую данность. Мы с изумлением взирали на икону святого гиганта с песей головой, чей образ стал символом невозможного искупления. И, наконец, мы услышали трагическую легенду об одиноком короле, чья тайна была тяжелее любой короны.
Before us is not one or two scattered tales. Before us is a colossal body of evidence spanning thousands of years, different continents, different cultures and religions. From ancient historians to church fathers, from Venetian merchants to Siberian hunters, from cartographers to anonymous storytellers, they all speak of the same thing. The last recorded encounters with them in the New World, according to the testimony of Christopher Columbus himself, date to the 18th century. In Eurasia, they were seen as late as the 19th. There is so much evidence, so intertwined and consistent, that to simply dismiss it all as fiction or mass delusion becomes impossible. To ignore this phenomenon is to ignore a huge part of our own documented history. But then, if we accept the probability of their existence, we face the main, most frightening question: what were they? Were the Cynocephaly a completely separate, non-human species of intelligent beings? A parallel branch of evolution that developed side by side with Homo sapiens but took a different path? A kind of canine man who lost the ruthless struggle for the planet, just as the Neanderthals once lost. Or were they human, but belonging to some lost race, an ancient subspecies with shocking physical differences? Modern science offers a simple explanation. They were merely people with rare genetic abnormalities, victims of a genomic glitch whom superstitious ancestors took for monsters. But can this version explain their widespread distribution, their population numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and their complex social organization? And from this question arises the last, darkest one. If they really existed, where did they all go? Their disappearance is a mystery as deep as their existence itself. Were they completely exterminated by our ancestors in a long and brutal war, of which no records remain except for that very hatred frozen in our curses? Perhaps dog's blood and son of a bitch are the last trophies of that forgotten victory. Or did they simply fail to compete, retreating ever further into dense forests and mountains until the last of them dissolved into the wilderness? Or perhaps they never disappeared at all. Maybe they just became even more skilled at hiding, and somewhere in the most inaccessible corners of the planet, the descendants of the Siberian little ones still live, avoiding all contact with our world. All the chronicles are silent, the maps have become museum exhibits, and the witnesses are long gone. Now that all the facts are before you, only the main question remains, which everyone must answer for themselves. Who were these beings, and what was their fate?